This is Private Matters. I'm Max van Praag. Welcome, everyone. This is a forum about authentically thriving in intimacy. Here we speak with experts, doctors, coaches, people with unusual stories about intimacy, sexuality, marriage, relationships, dating, any aspect of the field of relationship. Today, my guest is Ellen Eatough, who is a sex coach. Welcome, Ellen.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Great to see you. And you are a sex coach. You call yourself a soulful sex coach.
Yes.
And the topic for today is ecstasy as the ultimate healer. And I want to say right away that we're not talking about the drug, right?
Right.
We're not talking about the drug.
Absolutely not.
No, we're talking about ecstasy, and not specifically sexual ecstasy. Tell us more.
Actually, yes, sexual ecstasy, but I have maybe a different definition than some people. Because when I say sexual ecstasy, I'm including orgasmic physical bliss coupled with a sense of deep emotional intimacy and spiritual union. And when I say spiritual union, I'm talking about a sense of wholeness and union with the various aspects of ourselves, union with our partner, and a connection with all that is. You know, that spiritual connection.
Embracing everything.
With all.
Sure. So ecstasy as a healer. This may sound very revolutionary for many people. A lot of people have different reactions to the word ecstasy, I'm sure. What are some reactions that people might have? It's taboo, it's something you don't want to go, it's great, but I don't often hear people say that ecstasy actually heals people, that men heal women and women heal men by taking them to higher levels of pleasure. And this is your work, right? You help people have better sex and...
I do.
Yeah.
On both ends of the spectrum, both healing from sexual and relationship trauma, and then onto what we often consider the more positive side of the spectrum, those realms of sexual ecstasy. And I don't know anybody who doesn't have a sense of like, oh yeah, that'd be cool to experience sexual ecstasy. Maybe some people are afraid, but people, you're right, I think, don't think of it as necessarily, they don't think of healing off the top of their heads when they think of sexual ecstasy. But it's not only people healing each other, because it begins within ourselves. You know, you hear that all the time, it really does. And in our culture, we're so cut off, we're so divided. In fact, I was teaching a workshop in Austin, Texas. Mm-hmm. And at one of the breaks, I was having dinner with a teacher who was teaching another program at the same facility at the same time. And she said, you know, I know most people who do any kind of healing work have their own wounds. And she asked me what my wound is. And I went, wow, you know, I've done a lot of inner work and I've really explored, and I'm not aware consciously of having anything that people would consider a sexual trauma. And then the light bulb went on and I went, oh my gosh, the wound that I feel so deeply and I think is very widespread in the culture, and that is the wound which is a split between our sexuality and our spirituality, our physical manifest pleasure being on the planet.
But that sounds still pretty abstract, Ellen. Was there an actual event?
No, because it's everywhere.
It's in the culture.
It's in the culture. It's in our religious systems, and it's not only, you know, Western Christianity, for example. It's also in Eastern spirituality, where spiritual and mental is often elevated above the sexual and the feminine. Mm-hmm. And so one reason I feel sexual ecstasy, by the definition I have, which includes the physical bliss, the emotional intimacy, you notice I say physical bliss is often the sort of sexual genitalia and pleasure zones. Really, it's throughout the entire body, but it includes then the heart, the emotional intimacy, and that connection with the divine. And so that's really integrating and healing, and that's really the heart is the bridge, the healer.
So I'm listening to you, and I'm thinking of, for example, somebody who has been severely traumatized through childhood abuse, and who cannot get turned on by this loving, harmonious. They will get turned on if they're scared, if there is fear, or if there is pain, or if there's other thing. This is where they can go to a place of pleasure and ecstasy. And do you believe, with your experience, that people actually have to re-experience those things in order to free themselves? That they have to go to these places where they relive their abuse and their trauma before they can feel what you're just describing, this harmonious?
Well, that's a big question. The short answer is no. I don't believe people have to sort of re-experience in a first-person perspective what they experienced before. I think there are a lot of ways to release past trauma so that you can kind of almost imagine it as if you're watching it on a screen rather than reliving it as the perceived victim. Mm-hmm. But if we want to, there's a lot that has to be done for someone on the journey from that kind of trauma. But I do believe that it's most effectively done through not just talk therapy, because talk is in our heads, and those experiences come in through the physical and emotional.
Would you say that again? It's so important.
Well, I don't think that healing any kind of past trauma can be done through only talk therapy, because talk therapy engages the mental faculties, the head, and trauma goes in through our physical and emotional system. And so we kind of have to go back, and especially if it's when we were children, because we're operating in a whole different realm than we are as adults. And so we have to go back into more of a state that where we can access those feelings and experiences and release them.
Do you mean hypnotherapy, EMDR? What do you mean?
Yeah, I work with a number of tools and techniques. Hypnotherapy, eye movement, color light projected into the eyes, breathing, there's sounds. There's a number of tools that get us into our physical and emotional experience where we can release those things and kind of repattern and kind of access those places that often aren't really fully seen and understood before because they've been shoved into the dark because they're too painful. So to help us kind of pull those past barriers or, potholes out, the weeds, like pulling the weeds out by the roots.
Sure.
Rather than just cutting them off or trying to gloss them over or trying to kind of restructure them in our thinking. That doesn't work.
Right. I totally understand and agree that talking doesn't resolve, that the mind cannot heal the mind. It has to be a process that engages the subconscious. And from what I have experienced and believe is that experiencing pleasure or ecstasy is actually, that's what really heals it, that what really can really create peace and put the past behind us.
Yeah, I don't think it's the only thing, but I think it is very healing on many, many levels.
It brings peace, and if you really know how to have pleasure or how to give pleasure to your partner, and you work with
and how to
couples.
receive pleasure, because you can have the greatest partner on the planet who knows every tip and technique and skill, and if you can't, one of the problems that many people have is having a resistance to pleasure. And it's like we get to a certain point that we can accept and allow ourselves to have, and then we kind of go, getting a little too intense, getting a little too vulnerable. You might start expressing yourself involuntarily. You might start making sounds or grimaces or movements that are unexpected, and you might be afraid that your partner will judge you. Mm-hmm. So that's why safety and trust is so important. Yeah. But also, it's sort of like, what might come out that I haven't experienced before that I'm not sure I'm ready for? So I think resistance to pleasure is a huge hurdle.
And then people feel guilty or shameful about that. Women fake orgasms or don't show, when they have pleasure, they don't show it. There's discomfort around just allowing. And you work with couples primarily, right?
And individuals.
And individuals. Yeah. You do sessions and you talk to people. You give courses.
Yeah, I give courses. I give live workshops, and with the sexual healing, I've started doing programs online. also with groups, with couples. But, people are so, there's so much shame and guilt, sadly, around past trauma. I say sadly because people don't even, it's not their fault, but they still have shame and guilt around it. And so a lot of people will never even go to meet a coach or therapist to work with these kinds of issues in person. But if they can anonymously come into a group on the phone, or
yes, or the lucky people who are watching this show, maybe you can give some practical advice.
I hope so. Yeah.
Can you share something?
Now we're talking about healing or about sexual ecstasy being healing? You mean?
Yes.
Okay. Well, can I back up a little bit to kind of tell you how I come to this information? Because I think
why don't you tell us how you
helpful.
came to this and why you're doing this work?
Yeah, because for years I'd had the sense that sex, although I've been lucky enough to have a good sex life pretty much ever since I started having sex, which is I was kind of a late bloomer. But I always felt, and increasingly as I got older, I felt that there's something more possible beyond just physical pleasure, that there was a sense of deeper intimacy and a sense of spiritual connection that I just sensed was possible, but I didn't know how to get there. And then once about 15 years ago, I met a man who said literally that he and some friends were writing a book on the topic. And I had...
On what?
On the topic of sexuality and spirituality.
Yes.
And he said he knew how to take someone there. So of course I had some interest in that. Excuse me. So we actually did become lovers, only a couple of experiences together. But he actually did. What was amazing is, although we weren't in love yet, we were sort of on the way, but we weren't in love at that point. But he knew how to take me to a place that was beyond that everyday personality, where we really experienced unconditional love. We actually discussed this later. It was like a space that was beyond the everyday personality, and it was beyond that sense of being in love, not falling in love. This was like pure, unadulterated love and amazing physical bliss that I had never experienced the likes of. So it was like the full package, and I went, oh my God, how did we come back to this, And so we did another time, and then he disappeared. And he never even published that friggin' book. I was like searching the internet, and I go, how do I find out about this stuff? So then, my good...
So that was one of these things where you have to let it go, or you have to move on and say, okay, this came into my life for a reason, and he was not supposed to stay, and have to let go.
I didn't know what to do about it, and I really did let that go for a while. And then I met someone else a little over a year later, and he didn't claim to have any particular knowledge or write the book or whatever. But we came together, and it was pretty monumental, because when we first made love, there was this palpable heart opening and like connections, like they're eye opening for me and for him too, and amazing. It was orgasmic bliss, but neither one of us had a conventional orgasm through a 2-hour experience. Neither one of us even sought having that sort of peak orgasm. So we knew we were in new territory. And this sort of experience continued on and on, started having even altered state experiences during these lovemaking sessions. And we're looking at each other going like, well, we both have a fair bit of experience, but nobody's ever told us anything about anything like this. And the natural inclination I had was to want to share. Meaning, like, find out how this can be replicated so that other people can experience
this is not just for me.
Right.
Yeah, but it can happen to all of us, that we experience something very painful or very blissful that we think is not, we're not experiencing this just for ourselves. It's for a greater purpose, for a bigger purpose. And so that's what you had with this second man.
And at this point I was in the middle of my master's program in East-West psychology, which is a blend of Western psychology and Eastern spiritual traditions.
Yes.
So I took kind of an academic approach to finding the solution, meaning I researched a lot of ancient sexual traditions like Taoism and Tantra, and some indigenous cultures like Kadoshka and some others. I went to a lot of workshops. I also researched a lot of modern sex research that was looking into people who do have extraordinary sexual experiences and what seem to be the threads that bind them together. And also I was studying Western psychology, so I was putting all this together
Yes.
at the same time. And then during this program I met this woman, Dr. Jenny Wade, who was doing research on people having what she called transcendent sexual experiences.
Yeah, she wrote this book, about transcendental
So
sex.
I became a subject in her research.
I see.
And then when her book was being published, she called me and said that her publisher wanted her to do workshops. And she said, but I'm a consciousness researcher, I don't do workshops on sex, and asked me if I would do something with her.
Mm-hmm.
Now, by this time, I was actually starting to do workshops with people, but I still hadn't put together those 4 things that I ultimately ended up with. But through her query, it's like, well, what helps people open to these transcendent sexual experiences, which I hadn't really quite gone to yet for others. And so I spent a lot of time kind of pulling all my research together and meditating on it. And what really came to clarity for me were these 4 elements or 4 keys that seemed to be at the crux of it.
4 keys.
4 keys.
Yes.
And I presented, then we were both invited to make presentations at this international conference on sacred sexuality in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And they gave me a half-day workshop on how to open yourself to transcendent sex. And I had 170 people in the room, and I started guiding them through these experiential exercises and giving them this information. And people...
For people who don't understand transcendent sex, will you say it one more time?
Well, what Jenny Wade's definition is different than my definition of sexual ecstasy. Her definition of transcendent sex is when people who, when they're making love, they start to have altered state experiences, like a change in perception of who they are. Like they might be a different people,
Altered
or
states.
animals,
Altered
or
states. Becoming,
tree,
yeah, okay.
or a different place or different time.
Okay.
People were experiencing, past lives or being in the cosmos, that kind of thing.
Yes.
And I was one of those, having these kinds of experiences. So, so I was trying to give a workshop on how to access these altered transcendent experiences. However, people were thrilled with this workshop, and the next morning at the conference, people were literally, beating away through the crowd to come and give me hugs and thank me for the best sex of their life the night before. One woman said, our sex life went on a scale of 10 from a 6 to a 26 overnight.
Wow.
And
From a what?
She said on a scale of 10, our sex life went from a 6 to a 26.
From a 6 to a 26.
Overnight. So what I realized from that was that you can't, and I knew that you can't force these transcendent experiences. You can only maybe open yourself to grace. But what I didn't count on was that these keys really help people have fantastic, deeply intimate, ecstatic lovemaking, even if they didn't go into these altered states that Jenny's talking about. So I knew I had something, And one thing that I did in the...
What about those 4 keys?
Oh, the 4 keys. Okay. The first key is trust. And trust includes, that sense of safety, that trust, knowing that you can express yourself and totally let go and be spontaneous with somebody that won't judge you, somebody that can hold the space, someone that will be sensitive to your needs. So trust is a big one. Number 1, trust. Mm-hmm. Number 2 is absorption.
Absorption.
Yes.
Okay.
And this was actually researched by Dr. Sandra Scantling, who wrote a book called Ordinary Women, Extraordinary Sex. And she was researching what she called supersexual experiences. And she found a psychological tool called, it's an absorption scale. And she found that people who can absorb deeply into their sensory experiences, their 5 senses, their ability to kind of go into their imagination, and really fully drop into the physical, taste and scent and the sight and the textures of the skin, and be able to feel in all these ways. That they have an extremely high correlation with people who have what they consider, ecstatic sex or transcendent sex.
Yes, because they can get into their bodies, and they can
Right.
they can get into their senses and their bodies out of their mind.
Right, and the good thing is, this is not an innate aptitude. Some people are innately more, have a tendency to be able to absorb more easily into their experience, but it's something you can learn and practice and increase. So you're not stuck with what you got. You can actually increase that, so that's cool. The third key, so there's trust, absorption. The third is entrainment.
What is that?
Entrainment is a phenomenon on the planet, which we don't usually talk about so much, but it happens all the time. The first sort of big study that was done was, I forget the name of the guy, but in Europe, I believe it was in Switzerland, there was a situation where they put like 200 pendulum clocks on a wall. And you can't possibly set the pendulums to be in exactly the same microsecond, you know, so they're all tick-tocking chaotically. You leave those clocks alone for 2 or 3 days and they will all be tick-tocking in perfect rhythm with each other.
Oh, wow.
Now these are inanimate objects, right, except we've given them movement. When women who live in community, like in communes or spiritual communities or college dorms, their menstrual cycles will often start to synchronize with each other. So that's entrainment. Now our body...
So it's sort of an energetic alignment. It's an energetic...
It has to do with rhythms. It's got to do with the rhythms of the planet. And our bodies will tend to want to entrain within itself, within themselves, their own systems. So if we slow our breathing down, our brain waves will start to slow down, and our heartbeat will start to slow down, and they'll start to get into a new synchronization and that new slower pattern, for example. That's why people, breathe more slowly to get into a meditative state so they can slow their brain waves down. So and this is something the ancients knew, there are many ways in which you can get into entrainment with another person. They've actually put EEGs on people having conversations, like with therapists, and they find that when people are feeling that they're having this really incredible, in tune conversation with another person, at that point their brain waves are starting to get into sync with each other.
Oh, amazing. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
So,
and literally the eyes are the window to the soul, as Plato said. I mean, physically our eyes are like frontal lobes of the brain.
Yes.
So when we gaze into each other's eyes, and I don't mean staring, but I mean having that soft eye gaze, we actually start to get in tune with another person's brain. And if we start to breathe together, we can start to bring our systems, like breathing together is really easy.
Is that related to the eyes open sex?
It can be, yes. So breathing together will help us. It's a gross movement. We can actually get in tune with each other. Two couples, you want a tip for people just to lay together. It could be spoon style, so one person's on the outside and the person on the outside could put their heart on the heart of the person who's sort of on the inside of the spoon position. And just you can decide who's going to lead and who's going to follow. And the biggest person probably has to breathe a little more shallowly, because their lungs are larger than the smaller person. But if you lay there and breathe together, you'll start to come into attunement with one another. And it's a great thing to do before making love or after making love, or when you're laying in different positions, put your hand on each other's heart.
Sure.
And breathe. And you mentioned...
I just want to keep you on track with the 4 keys.
The eyes open sex, though, is another really valuable aspect of that, because it helps. It doesn't mean you have to keep your eyes open all the time. You don't want to strain or do anything that you have to do.
You don't want to have to close them. Yeah.
You don't want to have to keep them open all the time either, but just to allow yourself to have more contact. And one thing that's really incredible for intimacy is, start to allow yourselves to have more eye contact when you're having a meal together, for example, or just talking. But then if you can do it more and more during lovemaking, the ultimate is to maintain eye contact when you're having an orgasm, which is a very difficult thing to do because we tend to go inside. But at that moment is like the most vulnerable, out of control moment to share with another person is pretty over the top. And one woman was telling me how she had this lover for a number of years when she was living in Europe, and he kept insisting that she open her eyes during sex, and she's going, no, I can't do that. And then he got her to open her eyes more and more, and eventually he got her to open her eyes during orgasm, much to her resistance. And she said, oh my God, she said, 30 years later, although she has a wonderful lover now, 30 years later, she still remembers him as the hottest lover she ever had because of that.
Wow. So key number 4, Ellen.
Building and circulating sexual energy. And this is
building and circulating sexual energy.
And this
So,
is where
so number 1 is trust, number 2 is absorption, number 3 is entrainment, and number 4 is
building and circulating sexual energy. And this is where more of the sexual technique comes in. And you might say, well, sexual technique's not as important, but it's like fueling a rocket. And you can fuel a rocket a little or a lot. And if you fuel it kind of a little, you kind of get into the old Masters and Johnson map of sexuality, which is, arousal, gradual build-up to the peak of climax, and then it kind of drops off in resolution. But if you put enough energy and you know how to really work with and build and circulate our sexual energy from the masculine and feminine perspective, first of all, that brings you closer because you really have to understand each other's energies to do that. But also you can build the energy up, and so you start to develop these peaks and valleys and start to have the ability to ride an orgasmic wave and enter an orgasmic state for prolonged periods. And I'm talking half an hour, 2 hours.
Sure.
Indefinitely, and then maybe have a peak orgasm before you.
We are out of time, Ellen. We will continue this conversation in the next episode. It was wonderful to have you. People can find you on the web at
getabettersexlife.com.
getabettersexlife.com. This was Private Matters. I'm Max van Praag, authentically thriving in intimacy. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.
Quem mostrava esse caminho longe, quem mostrava esse caminho longe, esse caminho para Santo Tomé. Quem mostrava esse caminho longe, quem mostrava esse caminho longe, esse caminho para Santo Tomé.